So we want to run our application on the Android simulator. And for that, you have to visit developer.android.com/studio/index.html or simply search for Android Studio. That's the development environment for Android, and it comes with all the tools you need to run Android apps on a simulator or a real device. On this page, once you visited it, you can download Android Studio. Now I'm on a Mac here, but you will see the same link on Windows, and these steps are the same. It will also work on Windows, unlike Xcode, which we'll cover later, which only works on a Mac. So there you have to agree to these terms and conditions and then download Android Studio for your operating system. Now I just started the download and this will take a while. I'll be back once it's finished to walk through the installer and then show you what else you need to do to run your application on an Android simulator. So the download finished, I'll now execute this to start the installer. And there the steps will simply vary depending on where you're running this. On Mac OS, you simply need to drag Android Studio into the applications folder. On Windows, you'll walk through some steps. By the end, you will have Android Studio installed. That's the core thing. So let's now start it. So I finished the installation. Now I started Android Studio for the first time where I get this wizard, the setup wizard. You might not get this if you already had it installed. Now there I will simply pick custom to see what I can set up for installation. I will use the Darkula theme to get this dark look. Next. Now here, that's important. I'll choose Android SDK here. It actually added this automatically, and Android Virtual Device, which is the simulator. So make sure these are installed. I will also show you how to access this in the readily configured Android Studio in a second. So basically I got all of that checked and will hit next here. I'll leave the emulator settings to the default, continue here and click finish. And now it will download more components and set up Android Studio according to this setup. I'll be back once this finished. So the installation finished for me. And with that, we can now open Android Studio. Now, actually, we can choose open an existing Android Studio project here, because even though we haven't created one, well, we kind of did create one. Simply navigate into this Create React Native App project we created. And there, remember this Android folder? Open it. This is your Android project. So you can simply open this folder here as an Android Studio project. Because this is a normal Android project, which you could now also build and edit through Android Studio, though we won't do that. And you shouldn't really do that because it's easy to mess up things there. You will sometimes have to go in there and edit some things when you add third-party libraries, but I will walk you through that. But one reason why I wanted to open it is because I want to manage my SDK version, so the Android version for which we can build, and I also want to show you how to run a simulator. Now in Android Studio, you can always go to Tools, and there you should find Android. Now if you don't find the Android option here, as I do, you might have this error down here, this Gradle Android error, that it can't find the SDK version for your build target. You can then click this link to install the missing platforms, accept this license agreement, and in this case it installs Android SDK Platform 23. It's not the latest one, but the latest one supported by this React Native distribution here. So simply wait for this to finish. Thereafter, we'll see that it also misses the build tools. So I'll also click this. And you might not get all these errors here. That really depends on the version of React Native you're using and the point of time you're installing it, the latest Android SDK which was used by default, and so on. Now with all that, it should do something here at the bottom. You should see that Gradle builds your project. And once all of that is done, you should see Android under your tools window here. Now there are two important things. Let's start with the SDK manager. We basically just installed the SDK version we need. But make sure that here you install all the versions you need. Typically, that's the latest one. But then you also got an error. We got an error here. So we also were prompted to install SDK version 23. And for you, these versions might differ. If you basically run into issues with running and building your app for Android, try out different versions. These are the versions supported by React Native then. This, by the way, does not mean that you can't run it on devices with a later version. So that's the SDK version we built for. The next thing I want to do is, under Android, Tools Android, open the AVD Manager, the Android Virtual Device Manager. There you can launch a simulator. I already got one by default. You can also create a new virtual device. Pick from some presets. I'll use a Pixel device here, the Android Pixel phone, which is emulated. Click Next. And you should be able to leave all these settings as they are. So I will leave it as this. Use the latest API version, which proves that the app also runs there. And leave everything as it is here. And click Finish. Now with that, we got this available, and with this play button on the right here, we can now launch this virtual device. And this will now bring up this simulator, which looks like an Android phone and which allows us to basically run our application on it as we could on a real Android device. Side note, we'll also run it on a real device in a second, but for now let's stick to the simulator. Let's wait for this to boot up. And once this did finish booting, you can go back to your React Native project and in the terminal there, run npm run android. What this will do is it will now build your project for Android. Here it throws me an error that no Java runtime is available. You probably do have that, but in case you don't, make sure to install Java. That's required because Android runs on Java, and for the build process we need Java. Once you got that installed, you can rerun the command, and this time it should be able to build your Android app. And what it will do here is it really compiles it to Android code. That's important to understand. It really compiles your application to Android code. And it does this by translating all these UI components like view and text to their Android equivalents. And your JavaScript code, as mentioned in the first course module, runs in some tiny separate thread, simply spun up by some other Android code created by React Native. Because always keep in mind, React Native is managing your entire project. So it's taking care that all these things run there, but in the end it gives you an Android app, which really uses native Android code. So with that, we got all of that set up. It launches an extra terminal or command prompt window, which you should keep running. This is essentially used for live reloading of your app, some convenience feature, which makes sure that you don't have to rebuild your app whenever you change something, but that this happens automatically and that it ships a new version to your simulator automatically. But here you can see it doesn't really run on my simulator, and this might be different for you. For me, it doesn't run because this ADB command, which stands for Android Debug Bridge, wasn't found. Now, this should be available once you installed the Android SDK build tools, but sometimes it's not added to your global path. So the command is not known even though you installed the SDK build tools. Now, attached to this video, you'll find a file where I will describe how to fix this on Mac and Windows. On Mac, you can simply copy in this command, which you find in the attached file, to add something to your global path variable. Just make sure to insert your username here. And once you did so, you can run ADB to see if this works. Shouldn't give you an error anymore. So if you now repeat npm run android, it should actually be able to not only build the project, but also to launch it on your simulator. So there, let's wait for this to finish. You see it starts an intent and it starts our app. Now the first time this starts, this can take quite some time. On the left here, it's a bit small, but you can see that there it's building this project. And thereafter here we see our application run on a real simulator. So these were quite some steps, but depending on which setup you already had, this might have been less work for you. With that, we got it running on the Android simulator. Now, if that's all you want, you can skip the next videos and we go right back into the code and start working on that, dive deeper into components and so on. But before we do that, in the next videos, I will show you how to also run this on a real Android device and then how to run it on an Xcode simulator and a real iPhone. So let's move on to this in the next lecture.